As a result of the Missouri Compromise line being taken out in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty being the way to decide whether there would be slavery in Nebraska and Kansas, fighting erupted in Kansas. Now, no one really saw Nebraska as a possibility for slavery, but Kansas was highly coveted by people in the South, and obviously people in the North wanted to keep it free. So in Bleeding Kansas, you're going to see people pouring in from neighboring areas. From the north, in the territory of Nebraska, you're going to see people called Nebraskals. From the east, you're going to see people coming in from the state of Missouri, known as border ruffians, trying to turn it to slave. Now, you're going to have people from the northeast, abolitionist societies like the New England Emigrant Aid Company, who are carrying what are known as Beecher Bibles, which really are just rifles. So you've got people pouring in from all over to try to tip the balance of the state to their side, either slave or free. Now you've got people coming in like John Brown. Now John Brown was actually coming in from New York, and John Brown was very upset about the fact that the city of Lawrence, where the University of Kansas is right now, which was a free soil town, was actually shot up and burned by border ruffians from Missouri. So he's going to come back and try to avenge what is known as the Sack of Kansas. So at Pottawatomie Creek in May 1856, he hacks 5 people to death. Those people were alleged to be pro-slavery folks. And really more than anything, his message was sort of, don't mess with us, we're going to make this a free state. Now, actually, 2 days before John Brown's massacre at Pottawatomie Creek, there was actually a bunch of violence on the Senate floor in Washington, D.C. Senator Charles Sumner, who was from Massachusetts and was a leading abolitionist, had delivered a speech about what he thought was just how terrible popular sovereignty was in Kansas. And this speech was called The Crime Against Kansas. In this speech, he essentially compared the South to Don Quixote, famously from Miguel Cervantes' story, who would see a woman that was actually nothing more than a prostitute but thought she was a beautiful woman. Now, the comparison was that people in the South saw slavery as a beautiful woman when she was nothing more than a prostitute. Now, of course, these are really sort of terrible words to say of the South. And Sumner was pointing his comments at a well-respected South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler, really calling him out. Now, Butler's relative, who was also in Congress, but not a senator, he was in the House of Representatives, Preston Brooks, wanted to avenge his relative's shame, I guess, or the embarrassment of being called out like this. And he beat Sumner with a cane so hard that Sumner was unconscious. Now, actually, very few people, if anyone, actually came to Sumner's aid, showing that perhaps people thought that Sumner had actually crossed the line in his speech, Crime Against Kansas. Now, actually, what happened was that Massachusetts kept Sumner's seat for 3.5 years. He never resigned it, and he later did rejoin the Senate, sort of as a show of, we're going to stick with Sumner. Preston Brooks does resign from the House, but he's later reelected. He becomes a martyr for this cause, that the South is going to do something about it when the North keeps disrespecting it. And in the case of Sumner, Sumner is looked at as somebody who was willing to sort of take on the South, and it showed just how bellicose and hostile the South could be in response. Early in 1857, a very important Supreme Court case was ruled, Dred Scott v. Sanford. Now, what's interesting about this case is that Dred Scott was a slave, and he was a slave that had previously been south of the Mason-Dixon line and then had moved with his owner north of the Mason-Dixon line. Now, this was all happening prior to 1854, before the Mason-Dixon line was actually eliminated in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But in moving from the south to the north, the idea was that technically he could now sue for his freedom because he couldn't be a slave north of the 3630 line. Now, when he finally did bring this case after what had actually been decades of trying to win his freedom, Chief Justice Roger Brooks Taney, who had succeeded the Federalist John Marshall, ruled first that slaves could not bring a lawsuit. So the case could have ended there, but it didn't. Taney took it further. What he said is that slaves are property, and property cannot be denied under the Fifth Amendment. So therefore, no law can be made by Congress about people having or not having slaves. So what he was essentially saying was that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Now you may say, well, it doesn't matter because the Missouri Compromise line was gone by what Stephen Douglas did 3 years prior in 1854. But what's really key to understand is once you actually have a ruling from the Supreme Court, it means no law could be made in the future about that, about where slaves could and couldn't go. Now, Southerners loved the Dred Scott decision because it affirmed once and for all that they could have slavery anywhere. Now, popular sovereignty people like Stephen Douglas and Northern Democrats were terrified because what this meant overall was that you couldn't have popular sovereignty. You could not have people in a state decide that they didn't want slavery because if you go back to what Taney had said, there can be no laws about where slavery can and can't be because slaves are property and property cannot be denied by the Fifth Amendment. So this is really thorny for anybody like Douglas who supports popular sovereignty. People in the North, particularly the new Republican Party that had been formed just 3 years earlier, claimed that this Supreme Court ruling was an opinion, not a decision. Now, again, that seems to almost be Jacksonian in its way of quickly, dismissing what the Supreme Court has said and ignoring the fact that it is one of the three branches that have checks and balances on each other. Now, the South looked at the North's defiance and said this is just like the fugitive slave law. When something happens that the North doesn't like, they just simply refuse to do anything about it. They refuse to honor it. In the same year as Dred Scott, you're going to have a panic of 1857. Yes, people should be running for the door. But in this panic, like previous panics in 1819 and 1837, caused by, in part, over-speculation in land and railroads, you're going to see a different impact in the North and the South. So northern grain prices go way down. Southern cotton prices don't go down as much. And the South looks at this situation like, just like we thought, King Cotton rules supreme. And it becomes this idea that the South starts to think, you know what, we're superior, we're pretty invincible because of cotton. And should this Civil War, which at this point they don't know if it's going to happen, but it looks like it could happen sometime soon, actually occur, they're going to be in a real advantaged position because their crop is so much better off. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln, that Whig congressman who way back at the beginning of the Mexican-American War had asked about the spot resolutions, is now running against the very powerful Stephen Douglas for Senate in Illinois. This is not for the presidency. They're going to run against each other 2 years later. This is simply for the Senate seat from Illinois. Now, they have a number of debates throughout Illinois, and famously, they have a debate at Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln poses a question. It wasn't a surprise. Everybody knew it was coming. But he says, if people vote in a state under popular sovereignty to not have slavery, but the Supreme Court in Dred Scott said that that's not allowed, what wins? Is it the Supreme Court or is it popular sovereignty? Now, Stephen Douglas, who was a popular sovereignty guy, remember, popular sovereignty was the main way that he was able to actually get the Kansas-Nebraska Act back in 1854. You know he's going to defend popular sovereignty. So he actually goes in that line that says the Supreme Court decision doesn't matter. People's opinion is all that matters. If a territory wants to protect slavery, they can actually pass those laws. If they want it to be free, they can pass those laws. Now, that kind of rhetoric and that kind of logic was a very northern logic. That's in many ways what the people in the North had wanted. And so Stephen Douglas is going to start to divide the Democratic Party with that kind of argument. So now you're going to start to see not only is there the Republican Party, but you're going to start to see a split between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats that's ultimately going to result in the election of 1860, where you have 4 candidates running. Stephen Douglas actually won that election. So in 1858, he goes back to the Senate. Abraham Lincoln loses. He's going to spend the next 2 years getting himself prepared to run for president. But what's important about Abraham Lincoln there is he really was able to sort of step into the spotlight that he had never known before. While Douglas wins the seat, he really loses because of what you're going to start to see with the splintering of his own party that's going to make it very hard for him to win for the presidency in 1860. Now, in 1859, we see Crazy John Brown striking again, sort of in the spirit of previous slave revolts like Toussaint L'Ouverture in Haiti back in the early 1800s and Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831. John Brown wanted to invade the South, call upon slaves to rise up, and he was going to give them weapons that he had stolen from a U.S. arsenal, and he was going to establish a black free state. Now, John Brown actually did have support. He wasn't doing this totally on his own, and he did get money and guns from Northern abolitionists, and he went to Western Virginia with only 20 people. Now, this was going to be very hard to do with only 20 people, but at Harper's Ferry, he actually did seize the federal arsenal, and in doing so, there were deaths. It was not easy, but he did get the arsenal. The main problem, however, was that the slaves in the area didn't know about John Brown's effort, and they failed to rise up. And so the whole revolt didn't work out, and John Brown was actually captured rather quickly by the U.S. Marines. Incidentally, the man who did it is Robert E. Lee, who's going to later lead the South, the Confederacy, during the Civil War. Now, John Brown's captured, so I guess that could have been the end of the story. He's convicted of murder and treason. It's a very quick trial. Everybody said the guy's crazy, okay? That was really not up for debate. But he knew that he was worth more to the cause as a dead martyr than in any other way, and his hanging gave him worldwide fame. Now, the South looked at people like John Brown and said, you know what? He's the kind of person that represents the North, the kind of people that are willing to come in and kill us and free our slaves and take our property. How can we be part of a union with people like John Brown and people who support John Brown? Now, there are many people in the North who are like, no. We're not a bunch of John Browns. Please don't think of us that way. Yet, there were many abolitionists who were aghast. In 1860, the Republicans met in Chicago. Now, at this point, the party is only 6 years old. Now, the Republican platform, remember, is going to be your sort of classic Whigs, which are like Federalists. You're going to have an idea of a bank, you want a tariff, you want an internal network of improvements. So they sort of had everything for everybody. They had for free soilers, they were going to have non-extension of slavery. For northern manufacturers, they were going to have that protective tariff. For the Northwest, they were going to have a transcontinental Pacific Railroad. Again, that's your network. And then for the West, they were going to have free homesteads, this idea of very cheap land for farmers, which is sort of like BTN plus farms. Now, in Chicago, they met, and after a number of ballots, Abraham Lincoln is actually picked over William Hire Law Seward, who we saw way back in the Compromise of 1850, saying you can't actually ever allow slavery in the Mexican Cession because that goes against Christian morals. But Lincoln is picked. Now, so Lincoln is going to run as the Republican, and you got to figure out who he's going to run against for the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is pretty split at this point because of what Stephen Douglas has done relative to the Freeport Doctrine. The Democrats have trouble nominating a candidate. There's a bunch of squabbling, so they actually nominate a Northern Democrat, Douglas. They have a Southern Democrat named Breckinridge, and then there's a fourth guy who tries to come in. His name is John Bell from the Constitutional Union Party. So there are four candidates that are running in the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln is not even allowed on the Southern state ballots. And the South really says, if Abraham Lincoln is elected, we are going to secede. And when Lincoln is elected, South Carolina, true to its word, because they believe